if we talk about the participation and maybe not to go in this more moral question or so, but like what does the consumer of mobility need or want today? Because that's a little bit in the key of your question, right? We don't want to limit the participation or the people, but what do they actually want? I mean, do they want today have one or two cars standing in front of the house, and that's kind of the way of participation and mobility behavior, or did that change already, or do you expect it will change?
First of all, of course, you always have the problem when we talk about what people need. Who's defining that? Yeah, and so people would define that very differently for their own lives. Yeah, and it may even also, or it does even change over time. Yeah, when we look, for instance, at mobility generations or mobility biographies, I was also busy with, where we made many interviews about the whole life circle and how that changes, and in youth, and getting your first car, doing the first long distance traveling, later with a family, another requirements, another other preferences you develop, and all that. And also then personal, of course, personal likings, and also accidents, whatever happens in life. And so how do you want to define what people need? So even in an individual life, that is something very disparate over time. And then when we talk about entire societies, it's of course even more complex. And from an historic perspective, I would like to warn about any models trying to really strictly make definitions top down. That never really works. Yeah, and as we know from many other fields and experiences, and so also you mentioned, like, what do people want now? What can we observe? It's interesting, and I think we can get a bit more deeper into that later. Um, we find a lot of discussion about new forms of mobility, car sharing, new models of how to organize your personal mobility. And behind it, of course, always very much the idea we limit car ownership, we can reduce the car use in everyday life, substitute it or combine it in different ways, and so forth, make it more efficient. And yet, at the same time, while this discussion became stronger and stronger over the last 10, 15, 20 years, at the same time, the number of cars was still rising and still is rising. And as just lately, just a few days ago, the news hit um, the newspapers and the media that the density of cars in cities increased over the last 10 years. Yeah. So we have this discussion on the one hand side, and then some reality on the other hand side. So how does that fit together? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's an interesting point. I mean, you hear that, and I also have friends that said, okay, they sold their cars, they don't have an own car anymore, and you read more and more about changing individual, let's say, mobility behavior, at least trying to change this in terms of the ownership of a vehicle, right? But you say that this is not visible in any kind of statistics, right? So
yeah.
but how do we count this amount of cars? You mean, like, is that a number like per person in Germany, or just the total number of cars in Germany over the years? Like, what number you're currently talking about?
Well, it's of course the overall number of cars which increased, and and especially like also, which I find interesting in cities, like with its increasing density. But of course, we have also this demographic development behind it of people who moved increasingly over during the last 20 years into the cities. We will see how this trend is going on. And yes, I mean, you find these people who consciously decide against car ownership, but we have always to keep in mind how many people are these, how representative are they, and what is their background, what are their um, personal life situations. In a city, it's rather easy to make such a decision, and then it depends also, of course, on income and other things. Yeah, and readiness. And we should also not forget. Maybe we come back to this as well. That car or vehicle ownership or mobility styles or any use of transport, but especially, of course, marked with private vehicles, it's part of identity. It's part of how you see yourself in status, how you see yourself as a person, like what do you drive. Yeah.
I mean, I can confirm this. I see this behavior by myself. Also, I thought I'm not this kind of person, but I bought a hybrid car with a small battery, right? And it was really important for me to get the E at the end of the sign. And I understood then that this was only because I wanted the outside people to see that I have this car, because otherwise, I mean, there's no advantage of having this letter, right? I mean, I realized this later, but I felt so strongly that I need this, and then later I understood, oh, I'm behaving like I criticized maybe before that people buy certain cars because they want to show their status or something like this, right? But I have to admit that I have the same behavior in some form, right? So
Yeah.
it's maybe natural to that
Yeah.
the people
Yeah.
do this in some form.
And then depends very much on what kind of values you want to represent, and then what where you see yourself. And yes, and for instance, another phenomena is we have this trend towards, very much pushed now by politics, of course, and taken up by the car manufacturers. We have these bold statements week by week. Yes, we will change e-mobility by the years 2030s. Everything is supposed to have changed, and so forth. And yet, at the same time, we have on the consumer side also counter trends. Like you see that, which is also, of course, in a way a niche, but nonetheless, it's visible with two-wheelers, like motorcycles become more popular, and also the way how they are really driven out. You know that all these special features that you can give these motorcycles this extra roar. And the same thing, of course, you have for cars. So it's really like, it's almost like a kind of a protest against all this e-mobility, smartification, sleeker, more less noise and everything. And then you have these people and going like with this big roar and trying to show, even if it's just a gadget, it's not really even in the machine, but it's just a gadget, like how powerful the machine is, and you really to drive it out and like that. Yeah.